Thank you very much for the invitation. Could the Agenda Committee make themselves known for this conference? Who was on the Agenda Committee? Could they possibly raise their hands? Those are the people you blame if you don't like it. If this goes okay, thanks. Hopefully this talk will fit into where Stephen covered excellently earlier. And I've taken out, with one exception, references to what has happened in the UK for an important reason. What I've tried to do here is to cover where we could be heading and some of the reasons behind it. And what that means is the drivers for policy development. I think there's a really important choice coming up at the moment, and that is the extent to which one acts as almost like King Canute and accept that what is happening is a problem and that actually there's very little we as a dental profession can do about it, or whether we take or most importantly, where we can take a stance. And I was just talking with Mick earlier on. To me, there are the three P's in any care delivery arrangement. There is the politicians, there is the public, and there is the profession. And at the moment, I would argue that politicians are about as low as you can get. And that creates a wonderful opportunity. And that provided the profession can link in with the public properly, there is a wonderful opportunity to take things forward. But we've got to be very careful and make sure that we understand where we are with the public and make sure we get our message across on what they want from dental care in this country. The second thing is always remember where we are in society. What Stephen was able to do was to give us some figures on where dentistry as a dental profession we actually sit. Can I suggest that when this conference is over, you all go to the Institute of Fiscal Studies. You go to that website, and in the information section, you can put in your income, you put in your community charge, you put in the size of the family that you're living in, and it places you where we are in society that exists in the population. If you put in figures, as Stephen gave us earlier on, you will find that dentists are in the top 10% of earners within the country. And all I'm saying is we've got to be very careful when we start arguing about financial issues. I think there is a bigger issue, I think a really important issue, about the welfare of the profession. It doesn't need more resources coming to us to reduce the pressures on us. What we have to have is a sensible contract. And we have to recognise where that contract can and can't work. And what I want to do, and it's a pity Henrik's not here, I deliberately chose the EU to please Henrik. But there are four aspects where I'm going to go through that hopefully will lead into this story. I want to try and cover some fundamentals about any care arrangement. Doesn't matter where you come from, some way of looking at how you can control dentistry and what goes on within it. There's something about saying, okay, well, let's give it this comparative framework. How can we look at where dentistry sits? How can we compare systems? I would argue there's no point in just standing up and saying, well, look, we heard yesterday how well the French are doing over the potentially coming years. I would suggest they will do well maybe for a few years, and then they've got problems coming up. Not least of all, there is a really big problem, which we'll come on to, which is about the economy in general, which Stephen alluded to. There's some issues that arise from that, and then my thoughts on the future. I'm not very good at predicting. I had a friend at dental school who once told me this horse was going to win. So I put all my student money on it, and it fell at the final fence. He then gave me another tip and said, Paul, don't put it on to win. It'll come in third. It was about 120 to 1 as an outsider. It came in third, but I didn't follow him because I couldn't trust what he was saying. So I'm afraid when it comes to prediction, I'm not very good. But I can give you some thoughts But it's up to you as general dental practitioners and what you do to decide what it is the best way forward. Not for me to tell you. Hopefully, I'm there to help in those choices. Some fundamentals. The first thing is that care arrangements evolve as part of a society. You cannot lift an arrangement that exists in France, put it into Spain, put it into Germany, put it into Sweden. You can look at what's happened on some lines, but the idea of simply lifting what happens in one country and put it into another simply won't work. Indeed, I would argue at the moment that we've got 4 very different NHSs beginning to evolve. And it may be that going into the future, there are 4 different territories where they have 4 totally different sets of arrangement. But we have to be careful. At the moment, there is still this perception that the NHS is central to most people's lives. It's very important to people. Now, we can dismiss it, but actually there's a problem, because then we don't have the public with us. What we want to do, I would argue, is provide the best possible care to the public. Now, if a government says they can't afford it, that's what we challenge. The problem here is that all this is the government says there's no new money. They can find money for anything they want. You can print money till you're blue in the face. It can be funded, but we've got to make the right arguments for it. Every care arrangement has 3 aspects to it. There's something about the money, and I'm going to look at that in more detail, where the money comes from. There's something about delivery. What is actually delivered for that money? Who delivers, and where is it delivered? So you've got things like primary, secondary care, you've got nurses, auxiliaries, or whatever, and you've got co-payments, and we'll look at all of those sort of things. The third thing is governance. This term called stewardship that you would find in many documents, which is, how do we hold people to account? I thought the motion about the CQC was interesting. I always understood the CQC was there for the infrastructural aspects. The quality aspects, the ones where the DRO could be helpful, they're much more to do with clinical aspects. And would I like to see a DRO system back? Absolutely. But there to support the profession. It was interesting, so listening to some of the motions. I thought the motion which was talking about clinical audit and peer review, but using good practice to learn from that. Why is it as a profession, or why do we allow it as a profession, where we seem to concentrate on what is termed as the bad performer? It's much more, what can we learn from those people who are performing well? How can they help us to take a better system forward? The third thing here is that medical systems are totally different from dental. But I would argue there's an opportunity here. For those of you that may not appreciate it, all we're talking about is GA. Actually, the bottom line about these GAs is they're coming from medical practitioners' budgets. How many medical practitioners realize that they're paying for these GAs? Might be that if we could engage with them and understand where we're going, we might have better clout in what we're trying to achieve with this. The next 2 pictures are schematic diagrams. Vijay, as I said, asked me to talk about the funding arrangement. But what I want to draw your attention to are the 3 pillars there. In particular, if I think this works, this one about the fiscal context. I'm going to show a slide in a minute which highlights the relationship between patient charge introduction, changes in patient charge introduction, and the economy. And make a suggestion to you that actually the economy and its performance is central to what may and may not happen. And when you look at some of the things that have gone on, they coincide with important economic developments. And this is why when we come to look in projections, it's not just workforce that Brexit's going to impact. If Brexit impacts heavily on this country and the economy suffers, there will be a problem for dentistry. And in fact, there's a paper coming out in next week's British Dental Journal, which has looked over the shift between NHS and non-NHS for the first time in considerable detail. Now, the argument made in that paper is that most of the substantial development is when the economy was booming. Fits in with exactly what Stephen was saying. And the problem is, at the moment, we've gone through a period of very low interest rates. There will be a number of practitioners who are buying practices at low interest rates. I remember buying my first flat when interest rates on a mortgage are 15% and going up. And the real question going forward is, what is going to happen to interest rates? Because of all the money people have borrowed to buy practices, that's going to be a problem if it goes from 2 or 3% up to 15%. The next thing, and the crucial bit, was trying to put those three elements together. VJ was asking me about this, is the funding element in this square here. But you see all these elements that we're asked as a profession to look after quality, to make it more efficient, and to talk about transparency and accountability. I put the references in here. These slides are available. I do recommend that if you want to understand policy developments in care systems, these are the sort of papers, and particularly this paper, that was important because it's applicable anywhere in the world, anywhere, Europe, China, Spain. But the most important thing is then, how do we compare what's going on in care systems? Now, there are three elements here. There's the scope, there's the breadth, and there's the depth. And what these mean, he says, is the following. Scope talks about the eligibility. What we've talked about is patient charges. Actually, that's the depth. That's the extent of cost sharing. So cost sharing can go from very shallow, no cost sharing, to very deep, lots of cost sharing. And you can put it on different elements. So you can say for dentures or for crowns, this is the amount that you will pay in terms of a co-payment. For other elements, there's no co-payment. There's the breadth. You can talk about what services you might be involved in. So you can talk about whether you put in there an exam and a scale and polish and simple fillings. Everything else is outside it. You can pay for extractions. You can pay for primary care. You can pay for secondary care. Every country has different elements to it, and we'll see some of those. In an ideal world, you may say you want to be at the middle up here, where everybody's entitled, there's minimal direct cost sharing, and all dental services are available. And what I want to show is that all countries in various ways have contracted. What they've all done is shrunk either the scope, the breadth, or the depth. Now, the example I've put up here is from the UK. When you look at the timeline for co-payments, when it came in, the first co-payment. That first co-payment came in when Britain was just about to go back to war and get involved in the Korean War. The country was nearly broke. As Stephen has said, you bring in co-payments to either raise revenue, which it tends to be rather unsuccessful at doing, but far more importantly, to control demand. And you introduce it on dentures, it was a major treatment. And what it did, it stopped people coming in on a 6-monthly basis who had a problem with a denture and saying, do you want a new denture or shall I ease it? And what was actually happening is they used to say when there's no co-payment, I'll tell you what, give me a new denture. And so by bringing it in, you were deliberately controlling demand. But it was brought in at a time simply to control overall costs. And that was to do with the economy and where it was heading. And you can see the gradual change here. If you go down to 1971, for some of us, we may remember what 1970s was like. A time of total economic turmoil, high inflation rates, and what government did, rather than say it's not available, they wanted to pass the charging system on to the public, so they knew full well that the public would not make the same demands on dentistry. And I find it totally bizarre when the Office of the CDO says we want to encourage access, we want to get one-year-olds in, but at the same time putting patient charges up by 5% per annum. It just doesn't make sense. It's not like there's a whole line of one-year-olds crawling up the path to try and get into a dental surgery. The parents are the people who are taking them there. If you want to do anything, get rid of co-payments. There's different ways of doing it. If you move to a capitation-based system, then the co-payment issue is going to become how you handle it is going to be interesting. But actually, by and large, you've reduced the want to over-treat or something. So even if over-treatment was there, under capitation, the risk is under-treatment. The question is how you persuade the public to hand over. And as a thing, I think somebody else made the point earlier on. I think it was Stephen's point about co-payments. One of the interesting things, and as we'll see, is about why fee-for-service remains the common route, is the transparency that it allows the public to have to know what's going on. The real problem is, what prevention is persuading people to pay for something when it might not happen. And how you persuade people long-term to continue to pay for something that they may never get any benefit from, apart from a perceived problem that may occur, is going to be a challenge. And in many cases, I would say, scrap patient co-payments for dentistry. It is crazy. Why are people seeing more and more, going to see GPs more and more? Why are they going to A&E? Might that just be something to do with the fact they don't pay to go and see GPs? They don't pay at A&E. Now, I'm not going to advocate suddenly paying to go to A&E or paying to see a GP. Bring dentistry back into the fold. Say, scrap patient charges. It's the most sensible thing to do, and at least then you've got access, or improve your access figures. But these were just some of the ways, until we get down here when we start seeing suddenly now we're in a percentage of the costs up to a ceiling. And that's going to be the way forward. You just alter that relatively easily. So the issues are funding, some examples, and some of my conclusions. Sorry, this has got slightly messed up. If you imagine all funding for dental care comes from the individual, that goes into a dental pool. Now, what the state can do is take additional money from the individual. It can take it through taxes and then decide as a general tax to allocate it to a fund and pay for dental. Or it can introduce co-payments. So this little arrow was meant to indicate that if you use dentistry, it's a co-payment that goes into the large dental pool. And then you've got the state where all of us who pay taxes, that goes there, and some of which is allocated to dentistry. The other way about here in dentistry and pooling is that you can introduce a third party, something like Denplan, Practice Plan, whatever, where an individual can make a choice and put it into there. At the moment in the UK, those are the two biggest funding arrangements, a direct fee for service for certain items and the state through the NHS. This one is relatively small when one looks at the total expend on dental. What you then do from this dental pool is somehow apply it to contract holders. And historically, that has tended to be dentists. My question going forward is whether, I'll come on to that, is the dentist there? And then, of course, the dentist can fund other people to do the work. It can use associates, or it can use DCPs. But of course, going forward, it may be that rather than pay dentists, that you pay DCPs. This, of course, could be that you may say to people, if you want to make referrals to secondary care or see a specialist, it comes from your capitated budget. There's pros and cons to that arrangement. But then, of course, we've got a growing issue, and in some other countries, a far bigger issue, where actually some of that money, the contract holders, will have to pay shareholders. And I want to put up a slide in this. This is the, to avoid an Ian Gordon School of Mathematics issue. That I've just put up 5 examples here of countries and looking at the public spend on dentistry. You will find that Spain, for example, is only spending about 2% of its dental budget is through public arrangements. Finland is nearly 50%, less than Sweden that's next door to it. There is huge variation. But if you look at the per capita spend, again, it's enormously variable. And suddenly then saying, well, let's transfer or copy one model into England just doesn't work. But there is some figures that you'll see about what is public-private spend across Europe. Now, the issue for those countries is you will begin to see who gets what. You can have universal coverage in Finland, all except prosthetics for adults, children free up to the 18 years of age, and actually user charges are specified at a local level. In Sweden, you've got the Länder, the counties, that can actually also specify certain levels and variation in what the patient contribution is. The point is that there's variation. You look down here, Sweden, it's free up to the point of 20 years of age. Next door, it's only up to 18. You look in Spain, it's free for 7 to 15-year-olds. Some of them include orthodontics, some of them don't. So all countries, in some way, have moved away from a universal coverage. They've all started to identify what they regard as priorities, and nearly all in those priorities, it's a shrinking away from giving everybody in the population through state-funded arrangements. In this one, there's a piece of work at the moment. Canada are looking at how they fund adult dental, the elderly population. And they've done some work, which I've helped them with in looking at the UK. And what they've done here is to look at various different models and say it. And to me, there's a very important issue. When you look down here, you will find that it's a fee-for-service mechanism for all those countries for adult care for the elderly. And my argument is that is low volume, high cost interventions. And actually putting that into a bundled payment does not make sense. The capitation element of any element has to be high volume, low cost, where you can merge things together. As soon as you get in to the high cost, low volume products, there is always the risk that you as an individual care provider are the one with all the low risk, the high risk patients. And the way of doing that is avoids that. So, this was just an example of taking how the countries, various countries, are handling the adult population. All these countries are targeting in different ways for the adult population. In Spain, there's general, there's targeting. With those that are targeted, they tend to be ones with comorbidities. So if they've got diabetes, if they've got other problems, health problems, they tend to get dental as part of the package. If you're simply growing old, no, you don't get it. So maybe fluoride let everyone get diabetes anyway, and then you get free dental treatment. When you come down to France, again, this may have changed. This is a very fluid situation with respect to how France and they negotiate the contracts. But go down to Sweden. Even Sweden, which has always been held up as a country which has provided its citizens with as much healthcare as possible, it still does not regard dentistry as necessarily being coverage for everybody and has introduced co-payments in the way that it works for the elderly. This is a feature which I think is important and will come to impact in more detail. This is the corporate sector size. I have no problems with people setting up a corporate body. I can say the Eddie Crouch corporate body, the individuals. The real issue is when you've got large corporate structures which are funded by venture capital. Because venture capital are there to make money. And one of these days, some of these venture capitals is going to pull out, and that sector will create a problem as it did with Southern Cross. Now, I don't understand, I've raised this with the GDC on numerous occasions, they're there to protect the public. Why is it that we have to demonstrate our clinical competence? Why are the bodies corporate not having to present their financial stability? Because if they go under, there is a problem. It's not dealing with 1,000 or 2,000 patients. It's dealing with 100,000 patients. There should be, in my view, an ABTA-style arrangement, which means that every large corporate body has to have a bond in place to cover it should the unforeseen happen. And that way, at least to protect the public are protected. But you see here this huge variation in corporate arrangements. My suspicion would be that if we were to look at that in 10, 15 years' time, this will have grown all over Europe. There's some examples in Spain and Portugal where body corporates have gone under, they've collapsed. And patients have just been left alone. And actually, there's a way, as I said, there's a way of handling that, but actually going forward, this is important. Because I think one of the things that's changing is the way that people are, what sort of contract people are working to. So just some thoughts. All countries throughout Europe have moved away from a universal, comprehensive, and deep state-funded dental system. There are other routes through which people are being asked to get their dental care, which are non-state funded. The extent to which the organised care plan, third-party arrangements exist, is relatively small, again, throughout Europe. Targeted groups, but those targeted groups are country-specific. In some countries, they would regard children, firemen, police, as well as adults and senior adults as being priority groups. The targeting is very dependent upon each country. Children have tended to be managed differently from adults. Children in all countries, with the exception of Spain, but it's Spain that they've started to develop children's dentistry, much more so than others, than previously. Children seem to be treated differently. Funding is heavily dependent upon the economy. And so that whenever we're starting asking where may dentistry come from, I think Stephen's slight worry that he was saying about the elective choice of people buying dental care is all too true. And we need to be careful that if the economy gets into problems, then I would suggest to you that demand for dental care will drop and people using it. Employment arrangements are changing. What we're seeing is a growth in salaried positions in every single country. More and more people are looking for salaried arrangements to work within corporate structures throughout Europe. Now, one of the important things here becomes the taxation system that operates within the UK. I always remember Gordon Brown making a speech when he was Treasurer. He announced this huge positive message about the NHS receiving X billions extra per annum. Then about 5 minutes later, he said, I'm going to put up NHS contributions to pay for it. And of course, who's the biggest employer in the country? The NHS. So all the money that he was putting into the NHS was simply was going out again through NI contributions. And fee-for-service remains the most common mechanism in which dentists are remunerated throughout Europe. So just in summary, overall state-funded care has considerably reduced over the last 50 years in real terms. It's controlled reduction through one of three routes, either by increasing co-payments, either by identifying priority groups, or the nature of the interventions that are available. There's a rise in the corporate sector, and fee-for-service remains the most common reimbursement arrangement throughout Europe. And the salaried arrangements are there. So thank you for your attention. I hope that was helpful.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Paul, for a very informative presentation. We have, again, some roving mics somewhere. If there are any questions for Paul. Roger Levy, please, first, up the back. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. That was great. You had a slide which indicated, I think, that the money from patients and state via taxes went to... Can you get that slide back? It went straight, I think, from the dental pool, the payment pool, to the...
Was that the timeline of UK payments?
I think it might have been. Keep going back. That one. So it goes from the dental pool to the contract holders. Now, I'm not quite sure whether the contract holders are the providers or not, but if they are, as I assumed that they are, then you've actually got an extra box, or should have in the middle, between the dental pool and the contract holders, which are the commissioners. And, of course, that box really should have an arrow that just goes outwards into the void.
No, that's only in England, of course, the commissioner, or England and Wales. Right. You don't have commissioners. It's always intrigued me why we're sticking with commissioning as a process. I mean, New Zealand adopted a commissioning process, and it dropped it. It said this just isn't working. And I don't know why there hasn't been a challenge in the way in delivering care we move away from this term called commissioning. It's madness.
Thanks, yep.
Thank you very much. Peter Thornley, please.
Thanks very much, Paul. That's very informative. Just following on from that, really, there seems to be a double squeeze going on to bring demand down. So one is the rise of the patient charge, so that it's actually maybe more than what the actual cost of the treatment is. And the second one is there is no flexibility in the commissioning.
Yeah.
So is that the actual agenda or the policy is to drive those patients that can pay for their own care to pay for their own care? And is that the direction we should be going? That if your patients pay for their treatment, they want you to take out a private contract with them?
I think it's a question of whose agenda. My argument would be, and it came up, I think, again, there was the discussion about the time of the 1990 contract when that came in. My understanding was that at that time, there were 2 in-year checks. What I was always amazed about with the NHS, the single best report ever written on NHS dental funding was the Bloomfield Review. It was a fantastic document. And what that document highlighted is it only went out of sync twice on projected spending. And if you used to say to any business, can you project where over 12 months your costs will be to that level, they would say, give it to me now. They'd love it. And the 2 times it went out of sync was when the NHS was initially set up. You got no data, so you hadn't really got it in thing. But within 12 months, it was under control again. The second time was introduction of the new contract. Now, my understanding about the new contract when it came in the 1990s, the real problem was not registration, but it was the relaxation of prior approval. And it was the crowns and the bridges and everything that was done there that really bumped it up. And I was talking to someone associated with the practice board, because they used to have regular meetings with the DH and warn the DH what was going on and say, you've got a problem here, you need to do something. And my understanding was that Mrs. Thatcher was told about this. She had beaten the miners at that time, and her words were, listen, I've beaten the miners, I can beat 18,000 dentists. And that's why there was never a control. If a control had been put in place properly then, I don't think we'd have had the problems that we've got now. I mean, and just ignoring this new, or the present contract, which is just appalling.
But again,
Yeah,
so
so
there
is the
there an
government agenda, I would argue there is a government agenda which is trying to push as much away from state funding in this case. There's a phrase I use sometimes called disease to disease. My feeling is with dentistry that what has happened now is that dentistry can offer so much more. It is about, this is where this stupid term quality of life sort of starts to come in. Well, what does it mean? It's a nice little concept where you can put a figure in and say, right, that's 2.6, that's 1.8, have a bit more money up there or something like that. But we're moving away from managing disease, except in those groups where actually the rest of their lives are so crap. They're the ones that don't attend for immunisation. What we should be doing is looking, where's the immunisation rates? We don't need another survey to tell us where disease is. Look at the other health indicators that are there. That's where the problem is. The solution, I would argue, is not necessarily more money on healthcare, but it's dealing with the problems that they have in society down at that end of the spectrum. We need to do something about that. So what's government doing? It's recognised that this disease, same with orthodontics, the same with veneers or whatever, those are issues which it's saying, well, hang on, we don't really want to do this. Let's withdraw our funding and put it into other priorities.
Thank you. John Milne, please.
Thank you, Paul. Really interesting talk. You touched on the possibility of corporate failure, where the business model sort of going down, and I think you raised the idea of some sort of bond as a protection. In terms of the question, what do you feel the risk of corporate failure is in terms of how quickly the market could recover? If you remember, there was a phase, I don't know, about 20 years ago, when all the estate agents were taken over by corporate bodies, and then 2 or 3 years later, the original owners bought those businesses back at a fraction of the cost. So to what extent do you think the danger is there for the public in keeping dental services?
The problem with me is not corporate bodies per se. That's the idea simply fits in with a tax arrangement in the country. If creating a corporate body provides, because of the taxation system, gives you breaks to be able to do it, then fine, that's great. The problem is that there's 2 or 3 large corporate structures which are venture funded. Those are the ones that worry me, because venture funded capital will move quickly. And part of this is associated with the same in football clubs, where I would argue that when you look at where money has come from, money has come on from outside. How clean it is, I don't know. I suspect it's not that clean. And within 3 years, they start to move on and shift it into other areas. Now, when those challenges to that sort of financial structure occur, and I would argue that the corporates have survived, by and large, the larger ones, by reducing down the associate wages and pushing those down. That's when you start to say this is not sustainable. They've driven the, if you like, the cost efficiencies, not the technical efficiencies, the cost efficiencies down almost as much as they can. And there's a problem. They've relied on Eastern European labour to begin with because that was cheaper. As their economies change, they might not come back as frequently. And as such, there is, going forward, I think there is a growing risk of those venture-funded large bodies of collapsing. You're going to say, put a figure on it, Paul. I can't. But there's a way of avoiding that risk, which is saying you must take out a bond to cover that, to protect the public.
Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, it's been, we've seen in the social care sector, of course, where you mentioned Southern Cross, I think, and I was just interested to see how you felt the risk was there. Particularly, I agree with you about the venture capital-based bigger corporates. Thank you.
One more question, please.
Yeah, Paul, thanks very much. So,
Can you stand up, please? So, thank you.
yeah,
Thank
Simon Hearnshaw, Paul.
Thank you.
I am standing up, yeah. Heightism.
Oh,
I agree with what you're saying, but I'm interested in how you apply some of this, really, because that's the key thing, isn't it, in terms of modifying care systems that are state-funded. So, are you saying we need to move away from universal coverage, scrap co-payments, which I agree with, use capitation for high-volume, low-value treatments, but use fee per item for high-value, low-volume treatments? I think that's what I took from that. Were you in agreement broadly?
Be careful of the use of the word value. Everything a dentist does is valuable. It's low-cost items, so high levels of activity, but low-cost items. So you're making your pool the frequently done items. So things like exam, scale and polish, bite wings, simple restorations. Those are the things that I would put in a capitation pot. One of the debates is going to have to be, when a capitation fee comes in, well, what's in the capitation pot? What's out of the capitation pot in terms of treatments?
What's in fee per item?
Yeah,
or what isn't?
what isn't? And coming back to you, the message, I do think there's a unique opportunity at the moment where the split between the political decision makers in government, or the whole of society, and the public has never been bigger. And as such, there is a wonderful opportunity for the profession to engage, but the profession needs to engage. I can't see why there's a problem if we suddenly turn around and say co-payment should be scrapped as a message. And why would the public not buy into that? It's in buying into what the public perceive as forming that bond and recognizing. One of the other things that I think we should be arguing is the dentist is your advocate for achieving oral health, whatever oral health you want. Our job there is to help support the public in gaining what they think is their reasonable level of health, what they want from it. And that's where the other aspect of capitation, which must be addressed, is the length of time that a capitation agreement exists between the public and the professional that's got responsibility for their care.
Thank you.
thank you. Jason, did you have your hand up, Jason? Sorry. Did you want to ask a question? Yes? Yes, of course. Okay. Just stand up, please, Jason. Thank you.
Good question. I'm not sure I can answer that. Or nearly always it was laboratory stuff that was never included. Anything with a external component involved in it was not included in it. So things like dentures, crowns, bridges, implants were never included in capitation packages.
Thank you. Any further questions? Jolly good. Oh, one more question, last question. Gentleman at the back there, please. The last question, and then we will revisit motion 33.
My feeling is that there are a number of health user groups. So it's interesting, if I recall correctly, and as you get older, the recollection becomes more difficult, but I think it was Harry Caton that produced the report that covered user charges in health services. And always remember, there's a sentence in there that was talking about patients welcoming patient charges. And I have got no idea where that came from. And you look at it, you think, sorry, a patient wants to pay for this. It was just bizarre. Now, on that group, there were a series of other bodies that were there, like there's a number of, is it patient users? There's patient users group. There's a number of collectives about looking after patients when they use health services. My argument is that we need to start developing relationships with them, and I'm sure you've got them, but actually getting a coherent message across to say, can we put a campaign together to not necessarily don't talk about user charge, but actually how can we increase access? So we're taking on board the mantle that the government says we want to increase access. All health services want bums on seats. What happens, they get a bit twitchy about. But as long as the public perceive they've got access. So the message is the big barrier, and all the reports that I've ever read have highlighted there are two major barriers to dental care, cost and fear. Well, actually, fear we're beginning to deal with because we don't have the problems that we used to have to manage in quite the same way. It's still there, but cost remains, and we've never done that. We need to stand up now with the public group, almost use the public as saying, we want cost reduced. Maybe we start with targeted groups. I remember talking to a group of elderly people, and they were worried about their winter fuel payments. They're worried about whether the winter fuel payment they would get would cover their additional heating costs last winter. That's more than the maximum dental charge. And you wonder why they don't go to a dentist. Why is uptake so low in that particular age group? Maybe working with Age UK, all those other bodies to say, listen, let's reduce charges in this group. Let's make dental charges free for pensioners. Maybe that's a way of starting to break the shackles of the user charge group in there.
Thank you very much, Paul. Paul, thank you.